did.
Well, you're on my
I did.
questions for you.
Yeah, you can put whatever you want to ask. I
Okay.
have an answer. It may not be the right answer.
It'll be the right answer. Are we ready for me to start filming? Okay. All right. Hello and welcome back to Media Reporter with New York Law School. My name is Lauren Whiting and I'm a 3L here at New York Law. I have the pleasure today of interviewing Professor James F. Simon, who is a professor here at New York Law School. Hello, how are you doing?
Very well. Glad to be here.
Great. If you could, just let us know a little bit about you, how you started up at New York Law School, also how you decided to go into law as a field.
Okay. Well, I came to New York Law School in 1975 as an assistant professor. I was offered a job by then the Dean Don Shapiro, who said that I could write my books. I'd already written a couple of books, and I could teach constitutional law. And I said, that's an offer I can't refuse. And I've been here ever since.
Well, that's great. You said you've written a couple books, and I know you just recently published a new one.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure.
Well,
actually, it's my 8th book, but by the time I came to New York Law School, I'd published 2 books.
Oh, wow.
So the new one, which came out just a month or so ago, is on FDR and Chief Justice Hughes, and it's a book on the conflict between the President and the Chief Justice, and an issue which may be very relevant this year as the Supreme Court deliberates over the Affordable Health Care Act.
Especially with Obama making a few comments ahead of time in advance, right?
Exactly, as FDR made a few comments about decisions of the Hughes Court in the 1930s when they struck down a number of New Deal statutes. So it's very timely, as it turns out.
Yeah, I was reading through the book. It was actually a real pleasure for me, having taken constitutional law and being a law school student, and luckily being a 3L graduating soon law school student. So I've read most of these cases that are referenced in the book and sort of seeing the other side of what's going on politically and how that interchanges. How do you sort of think this reflects how politics influences judicial decisions these days and also within your book?
Well, there's talk again over the deliberations in the Affordable Health Care Act as to whether the court is going to divide along partisan lines. There are, as we know, 5 conservative members of the court, all appointed by Republicans, and 4 so-called liberal members of the court, all appointed by Democratic presidents. So if it divides 5 to 4, it would encourage the view that the court is highly partisan and very political. The justices, I think, don't see themselves that way, and as I don't think they did in the 1930s. They saw themselves as basically following what they considered was the right judicial philosophy. It just so happens there were 2 competing judicial philosophies at work, as there are today.
So now you mentioned that they sort of saw themselves as apolitical, outside of the political realm.
Yes.
What about the court packing plan that was offered by the New Deal? And actually, I'll ask you to expand on that a little bit for some of our viewers that may not know about the switch in time that saved 9.
Yeah, I'll talk about it. Well, when I say that they saw themselves as nonpartisan, which is probably an exaggeration, because as you know, under our Constitution, the President nominates a member to the court and the Senate has to confirm. So there's a political component to every appointment to the court. Every appointee will have had to have gotten the attention of the President who nominates, and if confirmed, by the Senate. So that people like Charles Evans Hughes, who was the Chief Justice I wrote about, I mean, he was almost President of the United States. He ran for president as a Republican in 1916, and had he carried California, he lost by only a few thousand votes. He would have defeated Woodrow Wilson in 1916 and become president. He was a 2-term reform governor of New York before he was appointed to the court. So he had a pretty strong political background, which is interesting compared to the Chief Justice today, Chief Justice Roberts, who has never been in the political realm at all. However, he's been very partisan in the sense that he's really a movement conservative. And certainly that was one of the things that recommended him to President Bush. Now, going back to the court packing plan in the 30s, it aggravated Roosevelt, who particularly very popular, one of the most popular presidents in our history. And he was reelected in a landslide in 1936 to see some of his signature legislation struck down by the conservatives on the court. They struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Those were the twin pillars of the New Deal for the industrial sector and the agricultural sector. And when the court struck them down, Roosevelt sort of asked himself, well, you know, I'm a popular president. The Congress has been elected, and they've passed this legislation. Why should 5 or 6 members of the court, or even 9 members of the court, life tenured, be able to thwart the popular will? So his solution finally was, in 1937, to propose a court, he said it was a judicial reform plan. That is, he was worried about that the justices were getting old and they lacked energy and they couldn't keep up with the calendar. And so he proposed to appoint 1 justice for every justice over 70 years old.
If I could ask one quick question, you know, when I first read about the court packing plan, I was astonished. I thought it was, having not fully read the Constitution my first year in law school, I always thought 9 justices is just what it is, but that's not necessarily true.
Never,
right?
no. It started with 6, it's been down to 5, it's been up to 10. And then after the Civil War, it sort of came down to 9, which has been the number ever since. But there's nothing in the Constitution that mandates it. In fact, Congress can add, as indeed the court packing plan, if it had gone through, would have added 6 justices. So there have been 15 justices of the court, 6 new justices appointed by Roosevelt, including someone to sit with Chief Justice Hughes. Well, needless to say, Hughes did not like that plan.
No.
So he wrote a letter to the Senate Judiciary Committee in which he said, thank you very much. We're quite abreast of our work, and we don't need any more justices. In fact, he even said, you know, it'll just make our work harder, and it'll take longer, because if you have 15 justices, like having 15 lawyers in a room debating, it'll take twice as long as if you have 9.
Right.
Okay.
One thing that I read and I didn't realize before reading your book was that FDR went to the people when he didn't get what he wanted. But you know, some of the history of political history of Hughes is that he also went to the people when he didn't get what he wanted.
That's right.
And I thought that was so interesting that they both sort of had the same process to get where they were hoping politically to achieve, but some of their ends weren't the same way, even though they had some of the similar means.
Well, you're right, that they both went to the people as governors of New York. You see, they shared that history. That is, Hughes was a 2-term reform governor of New York as a Republican, and Roosevelt was a 2-term reform governor as a Democrat after Hughes. And Hughes, when he didn't, and both of them were fighting the power establishment in the state legislature.
Right, electric and power because of the pricing.
But they were fighting the bosses who were running the legislature. So sometimes Hughes, as you correctly pointed out, he would go over the legislature to the people and appeal to the things that he cared about, and Roosevelt did the same thing. Now, when Roosevelt became president, he also went to the people. Hughes did not when he was Chief Justice. Now he's Chief Justice.
Right.
So he writes that letter, which did the job. It really helped defeat the court packing plan. But he was now Chief Justice. He was no longer the governor of New York. So he maintained his dignity as the Chief Justice, and he would not go outside it. And I think you'll see the same thing with Chief Justice Roberts. There's no question that he was annoyed that President Obama came out and criticized the court in his State of the Union after the Citizens United case in 2010. But he didn't really go out and campaign against the president or criticize him as the president could criticize the court.
Right. You mentioned something a few moments ago about how FDR was a bit frustrated that these justices were going to knock down his plans that he would arguably think was supported by the people. And in your book, you actually referenced a quote by President Lincoln when, in response to the Dred Scott case, that when vital questions affecting the nation, such as slavery in the Dred Scott case, are irrevocably fixed by the court, then the people will have ceased to be their own rulers. How do you react to this? How do you think that, how does that play out today with the court and with Obama and their interaction, and how did that play out with the FDR and the interaction with the Justice Hughes?
Well, of course beginning with Lincoln, Lincoln wasn't saying that we ought to, if he's president, he's going to pack the court. He wasn't saying that he hated the Dred Scott decision, was actually elected president in part because of his criticism of the Dred Scott decision. But I think what he was saying is that that decision wasn't the final word on slavery, on the spread of slavery. That what we need to do as a people is to elect presidents who will appoint justices who get it right. And getting it right meant to reverse Dred Scott. That was Lincoln's view. Roosevelt would have liked for the court to have upheld New Deal legislation. Indeed, after the court packing plan failed, he was able, through appointments, to reverse that trend. And the court in the late 1930s really did sustain the New Deal legislation. Much as after the Civil War, the court sustained, and even during the Civil War, sustained a lot of President Lincoln's initiatives. What's going to happen with today in 2012 with the Affordable Health Care Act, we can't know. I don't think even the justices know yet, because I expect it's going to be a very closely argued decision. And as the writing goes on in the chambers, there could be some switching of votes. But knowing what we do about the argument, it could go either way. And I would say that if it went against, if the court 5-4, and it's never going to be more than 5-4 to strike down the individual mandate.
I always feel like so many of the big cases are 5-4.
Well, it doesn't have to be. Brown v. Board of Education was 9-0.
Right.
But if they strike it down, it's almost surely going to be 5-4. If they uphold it, it could be even 6-3. I would see the Chief Justice maybe joining Kennedy and the 4 liberals on the court if they sustain it. What happens if they strike it down? Will Obama publicly criticize the court? I think yes. I think he'll frame it. He's already said that the court should sustain the legislation based on precedents. In my view, he's correct. Doesn't mean they're going to do it. And if they don't, if they strike it down, I think he's going to frame it for his fall presidential campaign. I think he's going to make the court an issue in the fall campaign.
Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think that sort of flies in the face of a separation of powers mandated by the Constitution?
Well, no, it's perfectly consistent with separation of powers. He's not going to do anything. He's going to campaign and say, we have to get justices who read the modern Commerce Clause doctrine correctly. Remember, he taught constitutional law. Mm-hmm. And a correct reading of the modern Commerce Clause is that this statute ought to be upheld. And if I'm reelected, he's going to say, I'm going to appoint justices who will read the Commerce Clause correctly, not what they want it to be, but what it has been over the last 75 years.
And rely more on precedent.
Yes.
That sounds, are there any Supreme Court justices that would be retiring within the next 4 years, or would he just add more justices?
No, he's not going to do that. That's one thing he's not going to do. He will criticize the court if they strike down the statute. I'm almost certain of that, as Roosevelt criticized the court during the 1930s, which I wrote about in great detail. I don't think he'll propose a Judicial Reform Act or a court packing plan, because most historians see that as one of Roosevelt's biggest mistakes. it undermined the integrity of the institution of the court. And the American people don't want that. No matter how popular the president, they're not going to want him or her to mess with the institution of the Supreme Court. But he will want to, if there are retirements, to appoint like-minded people. I don't think any of the justices would like to retire. I think Justice Ginsburg is probably in the frailest health. And of course, if she retired, it wouldn't change the dynamic of the court at all. However, if Justice Kennedy or Justice Scalia, both of whom are in their mid-70s, retired, then that would change the dynamic on the court. And suddenly, the conservative majority would be a conservative minority, assuming that a re-elected President Obama appointed someone more to his liking, somebody like Justice Kagan or Justice Sotomayor, who were his appointees.
What I mean, your book is so timely in where we're at right now politically and with the healthcare reform. When were you actually inspired? What inspired you to write this particular book on American history with the FDR and Hughes?
Well, I started about 15 years ago when I was teaching constitutional law at New York Law School. I started thinking about I'd already written a lot of books. I'd already written 5 books, but I said, well, where should I go from here? And I decided I wanted to concentrate on American presidents and chief justices who clashed at a critical time in American history. So the first book I wrote was called What Kind of Nation? And it was a clash between President Thomas Jefferson and Chief Justice John Marshall. And the issues they clashed over are still timely today. The notion of federalism, the notion of the role of the Supreme Court. And that book did very well. It was well received, and so I was encouraged to write a second book. So the second book was on President Lincoln and Chief Justice Taney. And again, the issues were quite timely because it's not just about slavery, but racism. And it was about the president's war powers, too, which are also, those are issues that are very timely today. So after that one did pretty well, too, I said, well, gee, maybe I should do a third book.
Maybe you've got a knack for this.
Well, and also it becomes a trilogy, which was not really what I was thinking about. But in fact, my publisher, Simon & Schuster, has an e-book book set of the 3 books.
Oh, is this an e-book on Kindles or
yeah.
on
Well, this book is on Kindle.
Okay.
But it's also part of an e-book set, which Simon & Schuster has put out, which includes all 3 books.
Oh, great.
The Jefferson Marshall book, the Lincoln Taney book, and now the FDR Chief Justice Hughes book.
Well, interesting. Let's see here. I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you hope to sort of have the reader take away from this book in your writing. Is it just more information about FDR? I mean, it's an intriguing book. It was a fun read, honestly. I liked hearing about, Chief Justice Hughes when he was younger and his upbringing. And then I guess I always think of our world leaders as being these exceptionally scholarly men and women. And FDR was sort of kind of lazy and kind of a frat guy a little
bit. As a
bit.
Student, he was lazy.
Right, as a student.
Not as a politician.
Absolutely not. Right,
but one of the things that there are 2 things. I think it's a great story. These are 2 great American leaders of the 20th century. Hughes is probably, after John Marshall and Earl Warren, the greatest Chief Justice in our history. And I think Roosevelt is the greatest president of the 20th century. So you have these 2 great leaders who had some similarities. The similarities are fairly obvious. They were both only children, raised by doting parents.
Overly doting parents.
And they both were Ivy League educated. They were both reformed governors of New York. And those are the similarities. The difference is, one that you point out, Lauren, was that Hughes was a brilliant student. He was always right at the top of his class. At every level, he was at the top of his class. He graduated from high school at the age of 12, and he was ready to go to college.
And they made him wait, right?
He had to wait a year before he could go to college. So he went to Madison, now Colgate, at the age of 14, and then he transferred to Brown and was a junior Phi Beta Kappa. They went to Columbia Law School. top of his class, made the highest grade ever recorded on the New York bar. Roosevelt, on the other hand, was sort of an indifferent student. He went to Harvard College and he, made B's and C's. He went to Columbia Law School, as did Hughes, and he flunked a couple of courses. He didn't even wait to graduate. He passed the bar, but he dropped out. And he practiced law, and he never liked it very much, whereas Hughes loved the practice of law.
Mm-hmm.
But Roosevelt was looking for his main chance, and his main chance was in politics. He was a masterful politician, in the best sense of the word. He really understood the common man, and he was able to communicate with them, even though he had grown up in a really very luxurious circumstances. The farmers in Dutchess County loved him because he understood their problems, and they felt like he was a friend of theirs, which is the keynote to being a great politician. And when he became president, he really did feel, I think, for the common man and woman. And part of that may go back to the fact that he was a little arrogant as a young man, and then he was afflicted with polio.
Mm-hmm.
And he never fully recovered. And I think that experience, that suffering, made him really understand the leveling effect of diseases or poverty.
It sort of gave him an element of humility
Absolutely.
that he wouldn't have otherwise
Absolutely
been able
so.
to get to.
Absolutely so.
That being said, I feel like FDR is sort of responsible for so much of the administrative state that we're in now with the New Deal, and so many administrations created. And I guess I have a professor that had mentioned a few times that the administrative state is unconstitutional, and I kind of disagree in effect, and I'm just wondering how you would respond to all of FDR's.
I think I know the professor you're thinking of.
How the administrative state, since the New Deal, if that is unconstitutional, or kind of expand on that argument and how it isn't necessarily. Yeah.
Let's keep it our secret. It's not unconstitutional. And in fact, there had been a fairly large administrative state before the New Deal. I mean, Woodrow Wilson established the Federal Reserve Bank, mm-hmm. Federal Trade Commission, and so on and so forth. This is not brand new, though it certainly it was accelerated under Roosevelt and the New Deal. But after all, we're looking at the greatest depression in the country's history, and nothing worked, that you couldn't just leave it to private enterprise to pull the country out of the depression. It just didn't work. Hoover tried that.
Right, I was going to say that was an interesting point that you made in the book, that Hoover sort of blamed the depression on World War I and outside factors, whereas FDR sort of was willing to take responsibility and say, we have underconsumed and overproduced. How do we fix this?
Yeah, and I think Roosevelt was right. Now, how far you go with the federal government regulation is something that can be debated, certainly. But I think Roosevelt established the positive role of the federal government in making sure that those who can't help themselves at least have a safety net. I mean, you talk about the Social Security Act, for example. Mm-hmm. Something we still have, or later on, Medicare and Medicaid. I don't think they're going away. They may need to be refined or reformed, but I don't think they're going away, because I think most Americans feel that they would like that safety net to keep them out of poverty, to keep them from debilitating diseases, or at least to be cared for if they have debilitating diseases, and so on.
Would you say that FDR, in a way, sort of I hesitate to say overstepped, but it seems like he played more of a paternalistic role as a president than some other presidents that might have pushed more of an autonomy role on the Americans, sort of, how do we create jobs more rather than...
Yeah, but that was Hoover.
and
Hoover, remember, Hoover was a progressive Republican.
Mm-hmm.
He was not a conservative Republican. He was a progressive Republican. So he was really looking for ways to energize the economy. The problem was he was faced with the worst depression in American history. And no matter what he tried some very interesting things. It didn't work, and he relied on the private sector and on voluntarism, basically. It didn't work. So Roosevelt came in, and I think it was very clear that not everything he did worked, and that he acknowledged that. He said, listen, if something doesn't work, we'll try something else. The thing is to try until you find something that will work for the American people. And it isn't all about the government, it's about stimulating the private sector as well. That was what Roosevelt was about too. He wasn't just for the government doing everything. Absolutely not.
Sort of
It
providing
was a partnership with the private sector. Absolutely.
Well, we are a little bit running out of time. I want to ask you one more question, though.
Okay.
You did such a great job of keeping the historical accounts neutral, and I could see arguments on both sides. You know, one chapter I would be all about Hughes, the next chapter I was all about FDR. Was there anything that you personally reacted to in all of your research and writing this book that you sort of had to keep under wraps when you were writing this so that you'd stay neutral?
Can't keep anything under wraps. Got to seek the truth. But one of the things I think maybe that you picked up on is that I admired both of them. Mm-hmm. I don't think I really favored or preferred one over the other, even though they clashed during the New Deal. I came away thinking that, again, they were two of the greatest leaders in our history, and that we were very fortunate as a people to have them as our leaders at a very critical time in our history.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. Once again, this is Professor James Simon here at New York Law School, and he has recently published a book, FDR and Chief Justice Hughes. It's available at your local book retailers as well as in ebook format, and a trilogy of 3 different presidents and their clashes with Chief Justices. My name is Lauren Whiting, and that's it for us here at Media Reporter. Thank you. And we're gonna
Okay.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Oh, I enjoyed it.
I love reading this book. It was
Good.
great. It was great. I tend to write in books, and I realized right before I started writing that this is a library book.
Oh.
So I tabbed it all up. But it was just great reading.
Good.
Are you working on any books now?
Not yet, but I have one sort of in mind, but I have to wait